Good morning, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. If this morning you were expecting a Giancarlo, well, surprise, surprise, you get Ayya Soma instead. We we swapped between yesterday and this morning. So welcome to Aaron, Geeta, Kumu, Nancy, Amaranta. Hello, Venerable Vimalanyani. Good to see you. And hello to Michael and Jayanta, and welcome to everyone else who is tuning in this morning for Sutta study. So this morning we will be reading from Anguttara Nikaya 590, so the Dutiyasekha Sutta, called A Trainee. But before we get into the text, we can start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namassami. So we'll be reading from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, and I believe all of you instead will be reading from Venerable Sujato's translation, which is quite, it's always lovely to have different translations so we can have a better sense of actually what the Pali says, what the original discourse says. All right, so the sutta begins. Bhikkhus, these 5 things lead to the decline of a bhikkhu who is a trainee. What 5? So we see that here. Let me get the Pali. We see that here there is the Buddha that is talking to monastics, and he's talking in particular of the decline of what pretty much makes us backslide in our practice. And when the Buddha talks about a trainee, that's a seiko, and that's basically someone who still has to learn, someone who is imperfect in the sense of the teachings of the Buddha, in the sense of we haven't done what needs to be done. We haven't become fully awakened. And it's quite interesting, the word decline, the one that is translated as decline by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, that the Pali is parihanaya, which means also diminution, wasting away. And I think it gives us kind of very good sense of the process of backsliding. Whenever instead of making progress, we go a little bit backwards. And the sutta continues, here a bhikkhu who's a trainee has many tasks and duties and is competent in various chores that must be done. So he neglects seclusion and does not devote himself to internal serenity of mind. This is the first thing that leads to the decline of a bhikkhu who is a trainee. So very interesting. I would say right off the bat, the Buddha kind of slaps us in the face of our worldly pursuits. I remember when I first started reading the suttas, and I encountered a few of these sort of admonishments from the Buddha. And I'm someone who actually really delights in work. I don't delight in having a job, but definitely I love getting stuff done. So it's very interesting. A trainee has many tasks and duties and is competent in various chores that must be done. Wow, what is wrong with that, right? That's the first thing that one would sort of think. Isn't that to be praised? Someone who is actually competent, knows exactly where things go, has a sort of overview of what the things need to be done at the monastery, or perhaps the monasteries, or perhaps the entire country, the entire Buddhist country, overseeing so many different things. And instead, the Buddha tells us that actually that is a hindrance in the path that leads to decline. And it's interesting because once again, we tend to think that, actually these things aren't necessarily like bad per se. They're not something, being skilled at even starting a monastery or running a monastery or doing a great job at the work period. It's actually not something bad. It's not something that is necessarily a hindrance per se, but the hindrance comes when we actually distract ourselves with such things. So that when we prioritize efficiency versus actually looking inwards, doing the work that we actually have, the reason why we are in a monastery to begin with, whether we are ordained monastics or whether we are lay people. So in the world, I remember when I first started getting jobs as a lay person, I remember the office job that I had, at a certain point they told me, yeah, you really have to make sure that you're indispensable. Well, actually, and when we get into practice, when we are monastics, my practice has been to become dispensable so that I'm not essential here at Empty Cloud Monastery. I can leave, today, and everything will go quite fine, quite right, quite great. And it's very difficult actually to do that, not in the way of actual, like the action of it, but rather the mental action of it. There is a lot of attachment and thinking, this place, wouldn't be here, could not continue without me. There is no purpose without Ayya Soma. Empty Cloud equals Ayya Soma first and foremost, and then everything else is, dispensable. But rather doing the other way around is already like a practice of letting go. It's already a practice of seeing, recollecting why we have put these robes on or why we are in a monastery to begin with. And once again, the Buddha says, by doing so, by instead, getting all wrapped up in all these different ways of, organizing the monastery, creating so many different projects, ideas, which are once again not wrong in and of themselves, but they're wrong in Dhamma. They're wrong in the way that they create an obstacle, a distraction in Dhamma. But in and of themselves, it's very important that they shouldn't be taken as bad, as something that doesn't need to be done. And we see, in fact, actually how Buddhism is a disorganized religion. Such a disorganized religion, so disorganized that it actually creates so many enlightened beings, so many special beings. And it's actually remarkable, this is what coming from the land of possibly the most organized religion. Catholicism is pretty organized, which is remarkable since it comes from a very disorganized country. I'm always quite amused by that. Nothing really works in Italy except for the Vatican. The Vatican is quite remarkable in its efficiency. But yet, when I remember approaching, going to different temples in whether it was the Thai temple, whether it was the Sri Lankan temple, and whether it was the Chinese temple, and each one of them had a nice nice flavor of disorganization, and I thought it was lovely and beautiful, because clearly the priority was something else. Clearly, the priority was not to get members of the church who were paying such and such fee. As a matter of fact, actually, it was free. Nobody ever asked me any money, any membership sort of thing. But rather, actually, everybody was welcoming. And everybody was happy to encourage me to practice meditation, to practice generosity, to practice all the elements of the path. So we see that fundamentally it's a question of priorities. Still, things, of course, got done because I still went to retreats. Actually, my first retreat was at Bhavana Society, a Sri Lankan Buddhist monastery in West Virginia. And in order to offer retreats, of course, there needs to be a certain level of organization. Someone needs to reply to the emails, someone needs to welcome you, someone needs to, organize the volunteers who cook, etc. So things need to happen in one shape or form, but it was not hyper efficient. If things went wrong, or if someone didn't show up, if someone decided to leave in the middle of the retreat, things kept going and it was still okay. It was all right, Because once again, the priority was not to have a perfect, whatever perfect means, perfect retreat environment, but the priority is to practice the Dhamma. So it's very clear to me, actually, when I went to a Changyan monastery for a retreat with Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, and I was a lay person. I remember, we walk into this beautiful monastery upstate New York, and looks like, a fragment of China that, was put in the middle of the United States, well, in the middle of New York State. And I remember at a certain point they show us our dorms, and we thought they were like, several different rooms, perhaps. Instead, the monastic there, the bhikkhuni there, opens the door, and it's this huge dorm room. Half of it with how do you say, wooden boards, half of it with mattresses, and about like 60 or 70, perhaps spots there. And at a certain point, all the women started running to get the mattress. Because if you didn't get the mattress, it was the floor. But I remember thinking, oh, wow, how very interesting. It's a very clear message of what are we doing here. We're not here to have a nice weekend, in this beautiful setting in the forest. Oh, kind of shabby chic in the in the monastery, listening to this some Dhamma, and then having some nice Chinese food. That was not about it, but it was about the Dhamma. And I was very appreciative of that. Of actually the fact that the accommodation was so Spartan was actually extremely, extremely beneficial to be able to receive the Dhamma from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. And actually, at that retreat, I took refuge for the first time in my life. I took the 3 refuges and 5 precepts, and I started calling myself a Buddhist. So I really got it. There's something so special. So once again, here in the sutta it says bahu kicho, much work, bahu karaniyo, so things that ought to be done. So it's not only that we, afterwards actually he says viyato kim karani yeso, so learn and accomplish then what to be done. So it's not only that we do a lot of things, that we keep ourselves busy, but we're also like, we know all the nuts and bolts of the monastery. We know all the different things that need to be done. Like the mind is constantly working. And when the mind is constantly working, of course, there is no time for seclusion. At the before Empty Cloud, we were running the Rockaway Summer House, where we were running retreats. And at the very beginning, the first years, I was in charge of the kitchen. So I was making food for all the people that were coming, or at least I was one of the people who's making food and planning and doing a million different other jobs. But I remember with the food, because I was very obsessed with food, I still am, but not as much as when I started. I'm working on it. But Champika always gives me a lot of work. Champika is our resident here, who is like an incredible cook. So I'm like, oh, okay, I now have to work on this. Restraint. But yeah, like I was, planning all the different things. And I remember sitting in meditation and planning the meal for the day after, and planning the shopping, and planning how to grow the food, and planning and planning. I would like sleep, like every single moment there was a thought of planning, whether it was useful or not useful. Excuse me. And that is just the nature of introducing, all these thoughts in the mind, all this like sort of restlessness. It's a form of craving fundamentally. The most difficult thing to do is not get stuff done. The most difficult thing to do is not do anything at all, which doesn't mean being lazy, by the way. It just means relinquishing any craving for, for anything in the world. So difficult, the most challenging thing ever. Which is why, once again, when we are on retreats, no reading, no talking, no silence. Well, whenever we have those conditions, the monastery never looks that clean. People will start cleaning every single corner of the monastery spotless. Start cleaning windows, start cleaning everything, like the corridors. It's because the mind can't bear to be by itself. And that's why we don't devote ourselves to internal serenity of mind, says the Buddha. So we see when he says actually neglects seclusion, the word that is translated as seclusion by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi is patisalanam, which means solitude for the purpose of meditation. It's often also translated as retreat. So we neglect retreat, and we do not attend inwardly serenity of mind. So inwardly ajatam, and serenity of mind, cetosamatam. So inwardly, once again, we don't allow ourselves to even suffer. So to explore the First Noble Truth. Even when we're, suffering, we think that we need to, overcome suffering by talking to other people. But in reality, that's another distraction from actually looking at our suffering. Because we're not experiencing it. We're trying to bypass it by blah, 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 instead of actually sitting with ourselves and seeing, how does this feel like? What does it actually mean? What is the Buddha talking about? What is the First Noble Truth? And so instead of going outward, the practice is to go inwards. And then the Buddha proceeds. Again, a bhikkhu who is a trainee spends the day on some trifling work, so he neglects seclusion and does not devote himself to internal serenity of mind. This is the second thing that leads to the decline of a bhikkhu who is a trainee. So in case we didn't get it the first time, the Buddha gives a few more details now. So trifling work, something that is not really important. And by the way, work, what is translated as work is, by the way, kamma here, kammena. So it also just means in general deeds, actions that we do that are of little importance. Things that are insignificant. And it's incredible the amount of insignificant stuff that we do every day. When we went on the winter retreat, here at the monastery for 2 months, we had a really wonderful retreat manager who's currently also present, Antoinette, who's so efficient, like much better actually than I am at managing anything. It was very interesting because I had for the first time no excuse whatsoever to to supervise anything. And all I could do is actually notice the tendency of mind of, once again, going to trifling work, like looking for different things that could be done, until she pointed it out, actually. Sometimes We think that it's monastics teaching lay people, but actually sometimes lay people teach monastics too. We all help one another. So yeah, so she skillfully pointed it out. She's like, yeah, I don't need any help. I'm totally okay here. I was like, all right, yeah, you are. I'd better go and work on my mind, and really, yeah, do the work of looking inwardly. What is this craving? And once again, as the Buddha says, this does not, if we start indulging in all these things, we neglect seclusion and we do not devote ourselves to internal serenity of mind. So what exactly, why do we need to, exert ourselves in seclusion? Well, the Buddha actually gives us that in more detailed information in Samyutta Nikaya 56.2. So I'll quote from that sutta. The Buddha says, monks make an exertion in seclusion. A monk who is secluded understands things as they really are. And what does one understand as it really is? One understands as it really is, this is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. So we need to actually put effort in realizing the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths, it's not like a, some beginner kind of thing. It's not some whatever, yeah, we got it, there's suffering. No, it's a very profound teaching. Actually, the Buddha says that all of his teachings, just like every footprint of every animal in the world, can be put inside the footprint of an elephant. In the same way, all of his teachings fit right in through to the Four Noble Truths. And once we realize the Four Noble Truths, we're actually awakened. And so it's fundamental to cultivate seclusion. It's fundamental to go inwards, to create these conditions. And it won't come naturally. That's why we're talking about going against the stream. Especially in monastery, we have so many lovely people always all around. I've never been surrounded by, such lovely people in my entire life. So it's easy. Like, you want to actually spend time with them. And it's all right up to a certain extent. Always checking what are our intentions, and are we really growing in Dhamma, or are we just distracting ourselves? And the Buddha continues, again, a bhikkhu who is a trainee bonds closely with householders and monastics, socializing in an unfitting manner typical of lay people. So he neglects seclusion and does not devote himself to internal serenity of mind. This is the third thing that leads to the decline of a bhikkhu who is a trainee. Speaking of which, yeah, this speaks so much about what we were just saying earlier. We all also want to be liked. And if we're surrounded by likable people, we even more so want to be liked and want to make friends. And it's difficult to, if we're not all on the same page, for example, not all on the same page of seclusion, not all on the same page of fully realizing the Four Noble Truths. It's, disappearing, spending lots of time alone actually can sound very distant, can feel very aloof, very like, what's wrong with this person? What's wrong with Ajahn Koyo? Like, he doesn't really want to chat about how nice the weather is, or what's wrong with Bante Sudaso. I just, wanted to talk about how delicious Champika's food was. Like, why don't they like me? What is wrong with them? Or similarly, we had a lovely resident May, a good friend. She would spend every afternoon 3 hours in a row, like sitting like a rock. It's like, oh, what's wrong with, May? Maybe like she prefers to like be there sitting like a rock for hours rather than speaking to me. I must be terrible, you know? And all these like ways of thinking can arise in the mind. And yeah, and then one can appear unfriendly. One can appear that actually this Dhamma is not nourishing. And that's because one hasn't really given themselves the opportunity to actually delight in solitude, hasn't given oneself the opportunity to go inward. And it's very difficult, it's not that once we put this robe on immediately, like we dispel all our habits. Well, it did happen to me actually for a week when I first, when I took Samaneri ordination, it was wonderful. I thought, wow, all I had to do was put this robe on. I was the most pleasant living being for that week. Like people would say things that normally would irritate me, and I was just a mind full of metta. And I remember thinking, wow, all these years of struggle, I could have just put a robe on. But then after a week, all my defilements ordained with me. And so all the bad habits returned because we've realistically put a lot more time and effort into cultivating those bad habits than we have in cultivating wholesome habits of mind. So the strength is still there. So that's why we need to train ourselves on a regular basis and recollect the teachings of the Buddha. And yeah, even though there are so many lovely people here at the monastery, well, actually we can practice noble silence. We can support each other in silence. Or we can support each other by speaking Dhamma. And we'll see that further on. The Buddha actually talks about this too. And what kind of talk we can have that is supportive to our practice, rather than just getting back to our old habits that never worked. We actually really know the results of those habits. How many people have we socialized with? How many sort of conversations, unskillful conversations we've had in the past, and what are the results? They're like, oh, this time is going to be different. This time is going to be different. This time is going to be different. And it's always the same. It's always the same result, always the same result, always the same result. So perhaps actually the problem is doing the same thing over and over again, not practicing the Dhamma. That is the one thing that we haven't done fully and completely. And once again, unfitting manner typical of lay people. Once again, it's important it's not dismissive of lay people. It's not something pejorative of lay people, but rather it's said as a reminder. In particular, the Buddha here is talking to monastics, a reminder of why do we put these robes on? If we put these robes on for the wrong reason, actually it can be more harmful than beneficial for the world. It's important to understand that there is a lot of faith from people that support also the monastic sangha for a particular duty, for a particular purpose, to attain liberation, not because we're cute and lovely, but rather because we are practicing the path towards awakening. The Buddha, in fact, tells us that we are in debt. We are his heirs. It's not that people support Empty Cloud Monastery because Ayya Soma is Ayya Soma and Bhante Sudaso is Bhante Sudaso and Ajahn Kavilu is Ajahn Kavilu and whoever is living here. No. It's because of the Buddha. It's in the legacy of the Buddha. And the Buddha reminds us monastics that we are basically in constant debt. Forget about the student loans of, here in the United States. This is bigger debt. We're in this debt that we cannot repay because we cannot get a job to repay this debt. The only way we can repay it is by attaining awakening. Then we're free of debt. A huge responsibility. So that's then, the reminder. You're not a lay person anymore. This is unfitting. Remember what is the foremost. Remember what is the purpose of all of this. And Then the fourth step that leads to decline, the Buddha says, again, a bhikkhu who's a trainee enters a village too early and returns too late in the day. So he neglects seclusion and does not devote himself to internal serenity of mind. This is the fourth thing that leads to the decline of a bhikkhu who's a trainee. So here, what is translated as enters the village too early is actually enters the village not at the proper time. So akalena. So I assume that it's like not for the intention, fundamentally entering the village not for alms rounds and returning late into the day, because probably you're, in the in the meanwhile you found some lovely lay people and you started talking, chit-chatting, and then you're like, oh, it's late. Oh, well, another day wasted. I guess I'll meditate tomorrow, kind of like I'll meditate on Monday, kind of like the diet. I'll start the diet on Monday. And Monday never comes. So once again, this is spending, our time socializing or getting distracted, fundamentally wasting time. And there's so many different ways through which we can do that. And the Buddha reminds us of that out of compassion. Again, a bhikkhu as a trainee does not get to hear at will, without trouble or difficulty, talk concerned with the austere life that is conducive to opening up the heart. That is talk on fewness of desires, on contentment, on solitude, on not getting bound up with others, on arousing energy, on virtuous behavior, on concentration, on wisdom, on liberation, on the knowledge and vision of liberation. So he neglects seclusion and does not devote himself to internal serenity of mind. This is the fifth thing that leads to the decline of a bhikkhu who's a trainee. These 5 things lead to the decline of a bhikkhu who's a trainee. Tamasuka. This is my favorite part. Yeah, so fundamentally, what are we doing with our time, and what are the consequences of what we're doing with our time? So we're planting all these seeds, or we're planting all this, salt actually in the earth that prevents then the mind from rejoicing in Dhamma. This is fundamentally what, the actions that we think are trivial, well, that actually are trivial actions perhaps, but we think that because they're trivial actions, they can't really have that much of a consequence. Instead, they actually have a really severe consequence, because it prevents the mind from being able to receive the Dhamma. So we see, get to hear at will, trouble or difficulty. So if we have issues, if we have trouble listening to the Dhamma, then everything that is being said can sound like spiritual bypassing, actually. It's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, don't get attached to that. Oh, yeah, just be alone, or, all of this stuff can sound like trite things, but that's because we haven't really put the conditions to be able to understand how profound the Dhamma is. And it's interesting because in another sutta, I can't remember where it is, it's definitely somewhere in the Anguttara Nikaya, but the Buddha actually talks about how when he speaks, for example, he gives a talk on virtue, the people who have at least a little bit of virtue developed, they will rejoice in virtue. And then if it's a talk on generosity, one will rejoice in the generosity. So like whatever we have cultivated, if it's concentration and the talk is on concentration, we will rejoice. We'll have like Tamasuka. So when we are not rejoicing in something, it's because there is not, we haven't like either planted the seed at all, or it hasn't been like grown, it hasn't been nourished, it hasn't become like a sprout, or let alone a plant. So yeah, once again, we see that when we have a strong hostility towards the Dhamma, or we have difficulty, it's because we haven't done the work, the preliminary work. So you can have the best seed, in the world, but if the soil is unfertile, nothing is going to grow. It's as simple as that. And the mind is no different than the soil. Actually, everything, um, when you try to grow anything, we've had for several years in Rockaway Beach a garden. I learned so many things from plants in terms of the mind. I can see how in the Zen tradition, the Chinese and Japanese tradition, there is so much emphasis on that. And actually, also how in the Pali Canon, the Buddha always makes metaphors that are related to the natural world and also to the agricultural world. Aside from the fact that it was, the daily experience of people back in the day, it's also something where you can totally see cause and consequence and interdependence. And yeah, so we see, does not get to hear at will without trouble or difficulty, talk concerned with the austere life that is conducive to opening up the heart. And we see how the Buddha is saying fundamentally that the austerities, they create conditions for the opening. That can also be said, translated as unveiling or purifying of the mind. That here is translated as heart. So, Ceto Vivarana Sappaya. So they're not something sometimes can sound like so hard and difficult and kind of awful, like skipping dinner, for example. That sounds awful. I mean, it didn't sound like anything. Maybe I had pascamma. I remember when I went to my first Theravada monastery, Santa Cittarama in Italy, and there was no dinner. I was like, oh, okay, that's fine. But I would tell my friends, and they were like horrified. Oh, how are you going to live? You're going to be there for a week. That's crazy without dinner. I was like, yeah, what's the big deal? I mean, it's a convention, eating 3 times a day, 2 times a day, 1 time a day. I mean, also very privileged because I think for the most of human history, actually, if you had, 3 times a week was already like a good score to eat 3 times a week. So I don't know how we got to 3 times a day. But yeah, anyway, like all of these things sound, not listening to music, not putting makeup. I actually kind of liked all of these things. And then I was a little peculiar, but but yeah, they sound quite dreadful. Ajahn Brahm apparently went to do gave a little teaching at a prison in Australia, and the prisoners there were asking him about his schedule, and he was, sharing the monastery schedule with, once again, no dinner and waking up at 4 a.m. for puja, and then no music, no entertainment. And they were like, wow, this is awful. We thought the prison was bad, but actually, like, we're having a great here at the great time here in the prison in comparison. Because that's how the mind works. We tend to think of any sensual pleasure as happiness. So whenever that is even presented to us as theoretically like not being happiness, and theoretically like us being deprived from all of the things that we find, we think, quote unquote, very, very important to highlight the quote unquote, we think that they are reliable, then wow, it's like the floor is not there anymore, or like this is horrible. And so this austere life sounds, why would anyone go through that? That's just horrible. But, and I guess that's where faith comes in. If we don't have a natural propensity, that's where faith comes in, where we take the teachings of the Buddha as a working hypothesis. So instead of rejecting something, we're like, how about I try it out? And you try it out, and then magically creates the conditions for the heart to open, for the mind to open up and become more wise, become more compassionate, become more happy. So all we're letting go, we realize, is suffering. Great news. And yeah, and this, creates then the conditions for us to be delighting in talks of fewness, of desires, of contentment. Contentment, so beautiful. That took me a while actually to get to that. That was big obstacle for me at the beginning of the path. I was like, contentment? That sounds like mediocrity. It's like, oh, yeah. I come from Italy, and my favorite genre was the opera. So might give you a bit of an idea of what I thought was happy. Like, oh, like big, strong passions. Otherwise, what is the point of being alive? And instead, actually, we just delude ourselves. There is, of course, the honey tip, but there's a big, actually, poison root. And so we think that in order to have that little bit of honey, we have to drink all that poison. And that suffering, is inevitable. So we'd better like collect all the little tips of gratification we can have here and there. But the Buddha actually gives us an alternative, a different way out, that it's not sensual pleasures, and that actually creates unconditional happiness and contentment. Yeah, like lowering the bar, but not lowering the bar of like embracing mediocrity, but just dropping what is unnecessary. And once again, then we rejoice in not getting bound up with others, and talks on not getting, on not socializing, instead of thinking, oh, these monks, oh, they're such, Debbie Downers. I can't do anything. I can't even like talk with people. Oh, wah, wah. Instead, we're like, oh, actually, it's quite great. Yeah. Actually, I can have a good time being with myself and getting to know myself and getting to cultivate happiness and contentment. Oh, this is pretty great. Yeah, I want to learn how to do it more and more. And so this then, yeah, talking about arousing energy, virtuous behavior, concentration, wisdom, liberation, all of it, it's a domino effect. That's what the Buddha actually says in Samyutta Nikaya 5540. What are the consequences fundamentally of all of this? He says, one does not make further effort for solitude by day nor for seclusion at night. Sorry, this is in the negative. that's not the consequence. But let me rephrase it. The Buddha says, when one doesn't do these things, the consequences are one does not make further effort for solitude by day nor for seclusion at night. When one thus dwells negligently, there is no gladness. When there is no gladness, there is no rapture. When there is no rapture, there is no tranquility. When there is no tranquility, one dwells in suffering. The mind of one who suffers does not become concentrated. When the mind is not concentrated, phenomena do not become manifest. Because phenomena do not become manifest, one is reckoned as one who dwells negligently. So yeah, once again, we think that this negligence is, not a big deal, but actually it creates the conditions for us not to rejoice at all in the path and to lose any kind of interest, getting very derailed easily. Because what's the point of all of this? But instead, once we when we create a fertile soil, then wow, it's just so much easier. Then everything else comes into play. And the sutta ends with, because these 5 things lead to the non-decline of a bhikkhu as a trainee. What 5? Here, a bhikkhu as a trainee does not have many tasks and duties. Though he's competent in the various chores that must be done, he does not neglect seclusion, but devotes himself to internal serenity of mind. Again, a bhikkhu as a trainee does not spend the day on some trifling work, so he does not neglect seclusion, but devotes himself to internal serenity of mind. Again, a bhikkhu who is a trainee does not bond closely with householders and monastics, socializing in an unfitting manner typical of lay people. So he does not neglect seclusion, but devotes himself to internal serenity of mind. Again, a bhikkhu who is a trainee does not enter a village too early or return too late in the day. So he does not neglect seclusion, but devotes himself to internal serenity of mind. Again, a bhikkhu who is a trainee gets to hear at will without trouble or difficulty talk concerned with austere life that is conducive to opening up the heart. That is, talk on fewness of desires all the way to the knowledge and vision of liberation. So he does not neglect seclusion, but devote himself to internal serenity of mind. This is the fifth thing that leads to the non-decline of a bhikkhu who is a trainee. These 5 things lead to the non-decline of a bhikkhu who is a trainee. All right, so that's the end of the sutta.
Annamayang Dhammakataya Sadhukarang Dadamase
Sadhu, 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 anumodami. Right. Well, welcome to all the friends who have joined us in the meanwhile. So if you have any questions, feel free to type it in. And Gita says, yes, I also like to remember the dorm room for our retreat. We were up by 4 a.m. Wonderful experience. Yeah, Changyan. Bhante Body is amazing. Yes, absolutely. I agree. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Yeah, Venerable Bhikkhu Body is a wonderful being. Very grateful for all his teachings. Nancy says, interesting, as I have been practicing, I've also recommitted to small-scale gardening of herbs and plants. Great. Well, there don't seem to be any questions or other comments. I don't know. Yeah.
There was the phrase, phenomena become manifest. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, I think that was from, where was it? Samyutta Nikaya 55, 40. Yeah, my understanding of that is, understanding phenomena. So understanding our experience, understanding the Four Noble Truths, understanding, going from ignorance to knowledge. So we see it's actually in the link. The mind of one who suffers does not become concentrated, and the mind that is not concentrated, when the mind is not concentrated, phenomena do not become manifest. So fundamentally, my understanding is that when the mind is in samadhi, then we can truly do actually the practice of vipassana, so really fully understanding the Four Noble Truths. Otherwise, up until then, we are partially perhaps understanding, but not quite. I mean, it is remarkable, like in the suttas, it's always that a monastic enters in jhana and then does the whole work. So there's always the jhanas, and then they understand the Four Noble Truths. Then different teachers, and there are different theories about it, of jhana not being essential. But from my understanding right now, I don't understand how that is not possible. Just because from reading the suttas, it always seems that is the case. But I'm still learning, so I'm not. We can ask perhaps Bhante Sumita what he thinks about that. Actually, I'll ask him tomorrow our monk chat.
Question. Was that? Yeah. What do you do if you have like a guest who comes, and you've had lots of guests come to stay in your monasteries? If you have a guest who comes, and rather than them, when they put all of their burdens down and they, take on a few duties, rather than like delighting in and like growing in Dhamma, they actually start like drowning in the seclusion. It's like they have too much time and they don't know what to do with their time and can't make their mind peaceful. Like you as being someone who like just naturally like can take on tasks. And what advice do you give people who are drowning in seclusion?
Thank you, Ajahn Kavil. That's a very good question. I would say that, well, there is part of it where one, once again, needs to give themselves the opportunity to drown in seclusion, because unless one gives oneself that opportunity, then they don't actually realize. At least that was for me as well. I mean, it's not that. I remember the first retreat that I went to at Bhavana Society, the first 3 days, I was like, oh, this is great. And then after 3 days, I was like, okay, well, and it was, 7 days. And my meditation practice was not that strong. So yeah, absolutely, there was the struggle there. And had it not been that I was in the middle of West Virginia without having a driver's license, nor a car, not that it would have been very useful without a driver's license, but I was stuck there fundamentally. So not having any option actually gave me the opportunity to work through that distress, which was very unpleasant. So drowning there is a good component. And then I would say asking for help. So we tend to, I mean, that's why we live in community. My understanding is that we are, that's my favorite translation of Anukampa is trembling together. So to a certain degree or the other, we're all suffering, we're all going against the stream. So it's difficult to one degree or the other. But that is why it's so supportive to be with other people who are practicing the same path. So if we are overwhelmed, if we're drowning, then we have other people who understand, who are on the same path, and ideally people who are ahead of us in the path. That's why I like being surrounded by monastics who have been practicing longer than I have. So you can, well, first of all, actually, sometimes there's no question to be asked even, because you're just inspired by their conduct. So sometimes the answers are in their conduct. Like Ajahn Pasano was here. He's incredible monk, and he was with us for, well, most of the time actually we didn't talk. But I learned so much just by seeing how he was going about the space or not going about the space when he was secluded and when he was surrounded by people, always like with a secluded mind. And then when I was struggling, actually, was having some difficulties, I went and asked questions. So someone that points you in the right direction. I also do that with Bhante Sutta, of course, when Ajahn Pasano is not here, which is most of the time. And actually, I've done it with you as well, Ajahn. So yeah, that is, I would definitely say we're not, we're alone in this together. So it is good to live in community, and it's good to ask for help. And yeah, and then there's useful ways. If we are a greed type, for example, because that's, I think, the people who struggle the most with solitude, perhaps, or with the austerities, are the ones where greed is the most sort of most strong. And I used to be, now I'm a hate type, but I used to be a greed type. And the way that I've overcome, or I still do actually, whenever greed appears in the mind, is to find a more skillful object for greed. So instead of it being champika's food, which is delicious and gives me to practice, then I'm like, oh, let me actually delight in Dhamma. So let me read the suttas and find something that really is delicious to the mind, but that is delicious in terms of all the things that the Buddha mentioned earlier. So like fewness of desires, contentment, solitude, and whatnot. So then you're still doing something, but it's something that leads you towards liberation rather than towards attachment. Those are my thoughts anyway. I don't know if you have other suggestions, perhaps, for people. Okay, I got the John's stamp of approval. And Nancy says, do monastics see when visitors are struggling and reach out to offer support, or is the responsibility on the layperson? I didn't know this was part of the process in my first 2 retreats. Well, I mean, if we do see someone struggling, then we will go there. But unless we have developed superpowers, which most monastics have not, because they're extra, then we don't read minds. And well, especially in this culture, maybe in Italy, it's very easy to see if someone is struggling, but Anglo-Saxons are really good at it. It's remarkable. I can spend, I've been here for 11 years in this country. Not that it's only Anglo-Saxons here, but it's very inspired by Anglo-Saxon culture. Sometimes I'm completely oblivious of what's going on in people's minds, and to the point that it can be shocking. Like, whoa, all of this time you've been hating the hell out of whatever it was, and I was never noticed. But yeah, where I come from, people will, let's say in this monastery, everybody knows what I am experiencing, but it's not necessarily the same, that I understand what everybody else is experiencing. So it's just, sometimes a cultural thing. But in general, it's always a good advice, and actually good practice also to humble ourselves, because really thinking that we're the only ones struggling in the world, that our, suffering is so unique, is just really not realistic, and actually creates even more suffering, because then we create this loneliness rather than aloneness, and we are lonely together rather than alone together. And it's a very different distinction. But, understanding that other people, their suffering has a different, perhaps, shape and form, but it's still suffering. Then we can go, oh, okay, actually, they can support me. They can help me. I can learn. They've overcome something. They will overcome the same difference, perhaps, That's also what made me ordain, actually. I used to think I was so, so, so unique, because who else, was born in Italy, then went 3 years to the international school, and then went back to Italy, and then, traveled here and there, and came from this, there's so many specifics in my biography that by the time I encountered Buddhism, I was so full of, I never went to a therapist, because I was no therapist can understand how specific I am. They're never going to be able to, figure out, this particular equation. And then as I started practicing Buddhism, everybody here comes from so many different walks of lives and countries and continents, really. And yeah, running retreats, actually, everybody kind of saying the same thing over and over again. And I started seeing the similarities of the mind, and how my mind wasn't that different. And we're all a big bundle of greed, hatred, and delusion. And that's why these teachings are wonderful. That's why they're applicable 2,500 years ago like they are today. All the things that don't make sense about the Dhamma are things that were later additions. They're not actually like the Dhamma. The Dhamma is so pure. But any kind of thing, then a commentator would come in the 15th century and go oh yeah, well, actually, I think that it's this, X, Y, and Z. Then that's the delusion. And it's not Dhamma, actually. It's not part of the canon. But the Dhamma is just remarkable. The only body of work, if you want to get into secular terms, that is not dated. It is incredible. I come from a land of incredible body of works, there's a lot of history and philosophy and you name it. But all of it sounds, yeah, whatever, not terribly I mean, good, this part, but also, yeah, those were the Romans, or those were the Greeks, or like, this, they didn't get on top again, back in the day or whatever. Like, it's just not particularly inspiring. But the Dhamma, instead, yeah, it doesn't matter. It's just exactly pertinent today as it was in the past. How beautiful is that? All right, so if that's all for this morning, we can end with 3 sadhus. And just a reminder that this evening and tomorrow morning, we'll have again Bhante Sumita with the last sessions of his talks on the gradual teaching. And then tomorrow evening, we have monk chat. So you can bring all your questions for the monastic sangha, and we'll try our best to answer them. All right, so we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.